right. So welcome. Thanks everybody for coming to both the department colloquium, but also Max's public defense talk and the culmination of his dissertation in the department. So Max is actually the first grad student who joined my lab. He contacted me not long after I started his position as assistant professor. He finished his Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and Plant Ecology at Juniata College and contacted me with an email that immediately identified that he wanted to work in suburban yards, looking at the ecology of how processes work in suburban yards. And so that is exactly what you're going to hear about. Sometimes the thing that you contact your potential advisor about does not actually turn out to be the project that you do. But in this case, Max joined the department and was extraordinarily successful at being entrepreneurial and seeking out grants. He got an NSF GRFP to support his fellowship, and then also received a Xerxes Wind Award, received a lot of important funding from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. You'll see some of the results from that site today. And proceeded to complete a really impressive dissertation, I think you'll see. I wanted to bring out a couple of points that I think are really important about Max. He always has had a very strong focus on extension and communicating results to the public. And so even while he was doing all of his dissertation work that you're going to hear about, he did a huge variety of outreach talks, some of them associated with insects, but some of them on ephemeral flowers and mosses and sedges, and all of these other kind of really important parts of the natural history of Maryland. And so that also kind of shows through in his dissertation work, this commitment to doing work that has an applied emphasis. And so last summer, the state of Maryland posted a job that was perfect for somebody who has a strong natural history focus and a focus on service, which was for the Maryland State entomologist position. And Max applied for that position and got it, but they told him he had to start in 3 weeks. And so he, in his last year of his dissertation, took on a full-time job, and our committee members who are here today and have done a great job of helping Max through were flexible about changing his timeline around. So for the past 6 months or so, Max has been working a full-time job and working on finishing this dissertation. So we're really proud that he has this position as Maryland State entomologist. It means we'll all probably continue interacting with Max. So without too much further ado, I want to just finish with kind of a quote that Max had in his application to Maryland a long time ago. He doesn't know I'm going to say this. But he said, "Some ecologists are compelled to study unexplored tropical rainforests, but my calling is the concrete deserts and turfgrass plains of the suburban East Coast." And I think that will come through in Max's talk today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to show you all what I've been up to for the past 5 years. So I'll get started. So in the United States, about 41% of urban land is residential. And so the residential landscaping practices that we do play a substantial role in the ecology of our cities. And because of this, landscaping practices can either be harmful disturbances or provide ecosystem services. And so, of course, the practice I'll be talking to you about today is the management of large fallen leaves. And we're going to start seeing this in our neighborhoods pretty soon. The leaves are going to start piling up on the sides of the streets. Some of these pictures are actually taken around this area. And in some jurisdictions, they will bag the leaves and they'll be taken to landfills. In most other places, though, the leaves are brought to composting facilities. As a kid, I was always excited when the elephant truck would come around. This is a picture actually taken in front of the library, in front of the Kelvin. So this is happening on campus as well. But altogether, the amount of material that's being removed from fallen leaves each year is over 35 million tons. So it's a huge amount of material. And just to give you a sense, that's about the same amount of municipal plastic waste that we produce each year. And because of this, you're hearing more and more people advocating for leaving the leaves. If you're on social media or Facebook, you'll probably see these things pop up starting pretty soon. But they're actually, and part of this is in order to preserve insects. But there actually hasn't been much research on this at all. Most of the research that's been done on leaf removal has involved these soil invertebrates. So studies have looked at what happens when you remove leaves to these groups, and they don't like it. But there has been a lot fewer studies that examine the fallen leaf habitat as spaces for overwintering life stages of insects that are only going to spend a portion of their lives in the leaf litter, and they're going to spend the rest of their lives in arboreal trees feeding on vegetation. And so because of this limited scientific research, because it's a wide-scale landscaping practice, and because of the high interest from the public, this is what my dissertation is on. But it's also important to make best management practices to have evidence from our scientific studies and to guide policymaking. But I also think it's pretty ecologically interesting as well, as we look at the different spatially distinct systems, temporally distinct systems that interact. And what I mean by that is, so here we are in a city or in a suburb, and the planting choices that we make, say, in the springtime, are eventually going to affect the leaf fall in the autumn. And then in the autumn, when we conduct our leaf manipulation, that is going to have some effect potentially on soil carbon dynamics or soil processes, but it's also going to affect potentially the overwintering community of above ground insects that are only spending a portion of their lives there. And that in turn is going to propagate up to the arboreal community the following year. And then that community is then going to populate the leaf community that winter. So you can see how we have things happening in different places at different times, but they're all being affected potentially by this falling leaf management. So this is my dissertation, the effects of fallen leaf management practices on overwintering insect communities and ecosystem function. In my first chapter, I look at the effects of retaining or removing leaves on overwintering above ground arthropods. In my second chapter, I look at the effects of retaining or removing leaves to soil carbon dynamics. And in my third chapter, I look at ways that we can mitigate these effects of these practices. So to start with chapter 1, we're thinking more about the life history of insects when they're not feeding on plants. We know a lot, especially in suburban areas, that if we plant native plants, especially host plants, if we plant pollinator flowers, these are all great things we can do to increase the ecological sustainability of our landscapes. But we have a lot less information about the life history of overwintering species. But to use Lepidoptera or moths and butterflies as an example, we might consider some species, like the polyphemus moth, that is going to overwinter above ground in a cocoon. There are some that will overwinter as adults. There are some leaf miners and leaf rollers that will overwinter potentially within the fallen leaves as it falls to the ground. Of course, we all know the woolly bab caterpillar that's going to start moseying around pretty soon, and that's going to overwinter as a larva. And many more species are overwintering underground as larvae. So in my first chapter, I ask, how does yearly autumn leaf management affect suburban overwintering above ground arthropods? And I have a couple questions here. So the first question is, what is the value of this yard space as overwintering shelter in the first place? And does fallen leaf removal affect taxa? And does autumn fallen leaf removal alter the arthropod taxa diversity or community composition? So my second question is about spring emergence of adaptogens. So to do this, I needed to recruit yards. So I got over 100 volunteers who wanted experiments done in their yards, which was pretty cool. But I had to narrow it down, of course, and I used a couple criteria. So my first criteria was very important. There couldn't be any chemical pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers. I wanted to make sure that I was testing the effects of leaf removal, and that was it. And I'll talk more about this in a bit. The other thing that I wanted was to make sure that these yards had areas of differing management intensity. Because we don't manage our yards consistently throughout the entire property. And these different maintenance areas, I made sure that they had the same tree canopy or at least the same tree canopy species. And that narrowed me down to 20 yards between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. and some of them are in the University Park area. So if you saw my traps in some front yards, that's what's going on. So if we think about a suburban home, generally in the East Coast, we're going to be raking at least our front yards. What we do in the back is more variable, and that's generally because the front yard is what's visible to everybody. So we're trying to put forward our best image of a well-kept yard for our neighborhood. And this is actually an idea called the landscape mullets concept. The idea being what we do in our backyard is more for us, whether it's having barbecues, playing soccer, a vegetable garden, but our front yard is what we're representing in the community. And in some communities, they even mandate that you must mow your lawn to a certain height or something. So I wanted to be sure to replicate the leaf management manipulations in both low and high maintenance areas. So within each maintenance area, I would do the opposite practice. So in a low maintenance area, where the leaves have been retained year after year, let's say behind a shed, in the backyard, I would remove the section of leaves, a square meter plot. And in a high maintenance area, generally a front yard, visible to the public, I would retain a section of leaves. So these leaf manipulations were done in autumn, and then in the spring, I placed emergence traps over each plot. So an emergence trap is this tent that you place on the ground, and it's to collect all of the insects that are emerging from arthropods that are emerging from the treatment into a collection level. But these can actually be fairly expensive. They're about $100 back when BioQuip was making them, and I'm not sure where to get them now that BioQuip is common. So I had to make them myself, and eventually I got the price down to about $25. That's not including the time it took to make, which was considerable, because I needed to make over 200 of them throughout my entire dissertation. So this involved tons of sewing, mist, like no-see-um netting, but also involved some cool engineering. So we 3D printed these couplers that connect the two collection bottles together. And then I used a hot knife to carve a triangle in the top collection bottle, and that's what the material would be attached to. So eventually that's something that looked like this. And we also made these yard signs that we'd place in the front yard so that neighbors in the community would understand that there's a scientific experiment going on and not be disturbed by these different traps. So to reiterate, the leaf manipulation went in fall, and then between March and July, the emergence traps were placed out. And then I conducted collections every 10 days for 8 collection periods, and that's where these insects are. And this was replicated in a subset of homes the following year. Now, if you remember, COVID-19 is around, so for a large portion of my PhD, I had been working from home, and my home became a lab space for a bit. Once we were able to move back into the labs, it was very helpful because I had a ton of insects to sort. In this study, well, throughout my whole dissertation, I sorted over 77,000 insects, and that's not including like Columbella or any, these are just the groups that I'm talking about today. In this study, 34,000. It's a lot of bugs. So for the first question, what is the habitat value of yards as overwintering shelter for bone ground arthropods? If we extrapolate the results of this experiment up, right, so my emergence trap was about 1/5 of a meter squared. So if we go up to a full meter squared, we can imagine that we're getting about 20 Lepidoptera from an area where you leave leaves in your yard, 297 parasitic wasps, over 100 spiders, almost 400 beetles, over 1,000 flies. So yes, things are living in our yards. What happens when we remove our leaves? Well, starting with Lepidoptera, if you remove your leaves, you reduce Lepidoptera emergence by about 45%. You reduce spider emergence by about 56%, and you reduce beetle emergence by about 24%. I didn't find any differences in parasitic wasps or flies, right? So these leaf practices are affecting moths and butterflies and spiders and beetles, but groups that are perhaps less tied to that leaf material are less affected. So now to move on to the next question. Does autumn fall leaf removal alter taxodiversity about factor diversity or community composition. So I had a lot of groups. I had to narrow it down to the ones I was going to focus on. So I focused on parasitoid wasps and lepidoptera, as these are groups that are of interest to home gardeners. Parasitoid wasps, of course, they're biocontrol, natural enemies. And Lepidoptera are important pollinators and food sources for the rest of our growth growers. So I ID the parasitic wasps to family, so that's important to keep in mind. Overall, I got 29 families. I ID the Lepidoptera to species by sending off light samples to be barcoded. So these are currently in the genetic database at Bold. And here I got 21 families and over 100 species. So it also affects diversity. So removing leaves reduced Lepidoptera species richness by 44%. And I assessed the Lepidoptera community composition using a constrained ordination, which collapses the variation caused by the treatments onto two axes. So each one of these points is a sample of a particular plot. And what I've done is I've controlled for collection date so that we can see the differences between the treatments better. And the sample points that are closer together have more similar communities. Each one of these is one of those Lepidoptera species. And this is the weighted average and standard error of the samples within each treatment group. So the species scores that are closer to those treatment circles, those points that are closer to those treatment circles are more associated with that particular treatment. So if you have the areas where you retain leaves, well, you see they diverge from the areas where you remove leaves. So you do see differences here. And I want to pull out a couple groups. Well, first, this is consistent in both high maintenance and low maintenance areas. But I want to point to a couple groups here. So we have leaf miners are associated with these areas where you retain your leaves. And also groups that overwinter as larvae in the caterpillar stage. So for instance, we might have the speckled renia or the gray renia. And this is a caterpillar that actually feeds on detritus, on decaying leaves, which is something you don't really think about caterpillars doing, but it's one of the litter moths that we have. So those are the groups that would be more affected here. To move on to parasitoid wasps, I didn't see any effects to species, to family richness. But again, I'm seeing compositional differences between the areas where you remove leaves and the areas where you retain leaves. And if we pull out a couple groups here, we see the family Eulophidae and the family Pneumonidae. So, in summary, we have removing leaves is going to reduce species richness and shift community composition. It's going to be affecting groups like leaf miners, groups with life history traits of overwintering in leaves and overwintering in larvae. We're not seeing effects to the family richness of parasitic wasps, but we are seeing shifts in the family composition to these groups. And I just want to point out these in particular because the Eulophidae specialize on leaf miners, and the Pneumonidae specialize on parasitizing larval insects. So I thought that was pretty interesting. We're seeing this is being propagated throughout the food chain. This is working its way through the review process, and if you're interested in reading the free print, you can find it at SSRPA. Okay, let's move to chapter 2. This looked at if there were long-term effects, if long-term urban leaf removal led to affect soil carbon dynamics. So there has been a ton of research in cities, but it has been estimated that about 16.4 million tons of carbon are in those fallen leaves in our cities. And one study looked at the litter bags on the sides of roads and estimated how much carbon was in it. And they got this number of about 50% of that litterful carbon was removed from the city of Boston. Now, long-term leaf manipulation studies are hard to do, but there are a couple. There's one in Panama. This is a tropical forest where they remove leaves years every year. There's the dirt net studies, and one of their treatments is to remove leaves. Generally, these don't go past 20, 25 years or so. And there are very few, I can't think of any that take place in cities. So one place that we can turn to is looking at a historical practice of removing fallen leaves. So in the Middle Ages, in European countries, farmers would gather in huge parties. They'd go into the woods, they'd gather fallen leaves to use as bedding for themselves and also for their livestock. And because of that, we've seen that there's legacy effects of reduced soil carbon today, even though the practice has ceased for over 130 years. So it's these legacy effects that I'm interested in. Now, of course, the Middle Ages are a much larger period of time than suburbia has been around for, but some homes have been around for over 100 years, some suburban sites. So I just want to touch base with you all about the cycle of the carbon that comes out of our leaves. So a lot of it is going to be respired by microbes as CO2. Right? So that's a huge amount of it. Some of it is going to be leached in through the water as dissolved carbon into our groundwater. And generally these processes, we could say, okay, this is decomposition. But some carbon is going to be stabilized as soil aggregate, within soil aggregates, microbial necromasses, some calcitrant plant fibers, roots, and this is going to create that standing soil organic carbon. So I wanted to look at both of these and ask, do historical leaf removal practices in residential yards lead to legacy effects? And what I mean by that is that these effects are going to persist even after alternative leaf management practices have been implemented. So using the same experimental design, right, we have these low maintenance areas where leaves have been historically retained and areas where leaves have been historically removed. And again, just when we use these for the emergence traps, we can also use them to look at decomposition and soil carbon. So to measure decomposition, I use tea bags. So a lot of times we use litter bags, which is just taking the leaf litter and putting them in a mesh bag and then measuring the mass loss. Here we can use a standardized substrate, and because of that, this can help with global studies that occur in different nations across the world with potentially different types of leaf litter. And here, it involves using a labile type of tea, something that can be easily broken down, and that's the green tea, and then rubus tea is this more recalcitrant tea material. And this tea bag index uses both the green and the red tea to calculate a decay. So the tea would be dried, it would be weighed, then you place it into the ground. After 90 days, you pull it out of the ground, you re-dry it, and you re-weigh it. And that's going to get you the mass loss, which you can use to calculate the decay. So just to go over this again, remember the litter manipulations are happening in the fall, and then in the spring, the tea bags would go in the ground. I would take a reference soil core to calculate soil carbon. The tea bags would stay in there until June when I pull them out, do another soil core, and then process happen again in a subset of the homes the following year. So if we were going to see a legacy effect, it might look something like this, where we have differences between where we historically removed leaves and where we historically retained leaves. We're not seeing differences in those leaf management practices that I implemented over the course of 2 years. On the other hand, we might not find anything. So here we're seeing no difference historically or currently. Or we might see a current management effect where we don't see differences in the historical management, but my litter manipulations that I did are showing differences. So really we're looking on the left side to see if we find a legacy effect. And that's what we found. So areas where leaves were historically removed had 17% slower decomposition rates, but there was no difference between the historical, or no difference between the current management that I implemented. And I found the same thing for soil carbon. So here we have historically removed areas have 24% less soil carbon than areas where leaves were historically removed. This is of the reference soil core that was taken in March. Then in June, when the soil core was taken again, found the same thing. Historically removed areas had 16% less carbon than historically retained areas, but we're not seeing any difference in the current leaf management practices. So we're seeing signs of a legacy effect of reduced decomposition rates and soil organic carbon. So the soil processes are not as impacted by these short-term leaf management practices as insects were in my first chapter. These effects are taking a while to build up, and we can see that by looking at this amount of soil carbon within the homes over the years. So the older homes had more soil carbon than the new homes. And I just want to mention this briefly in my final chapter, although I won't be discussing that part yet. I implemented litter manipulations for 4 years, and I was starting to see effects of decomposition. So that could be around the area where we're starting to see effects, but they take a while, right? This paper has been published at Plants, People, Planet, so you can read more. In the final chapter, I asked, okay, we know we have these effects to decomposition, soil carbon, to these overwintering communities. What can we do about it? So I looked at alternative leaf management strategies. Some you hear about a lot are shredding or mulching your leaves, and also moving your leaves and piling them. So there's this idea of a soft landing, which was developed by Desiree Narango and Heather Holm. The idea being, under these trees, in the perimeter of your yard, you can move leaves from areas where you don't want them, and that can support animals. There's some cool graphics and everything, but I don't believe it's been studied explicitly. So these two treatments were added. The other thing about thinking about the different ways in which we manage our leaf litter is leaf litter could be acting as a blanket, basically insulating the ground from drastic temperature changes, right? And so from shredding leaves or removing leaves, we could be affecting the ability of the soil to buffer temperature changes, which could lead to mortality or reduced fitness. The other thing I wanted to look at was our planting choices. Does the diversity of the trees that we plant potentially mitigate some of the effects of management? So to think about this, there's this general idea that diversity begets diversity when it comes to herbivorous groups. So a lot of studies have shown in grasslands and in forests that areas with diverse trees tend to have more species-rich caterpillar communities. And in fact, in the experimental plot system, which I'll be talking about, our lab has done multiple years of surveys and found that areas that have only one tree species or a monoculture have less caterpillar species than plots that have multiple tree species or mixtures. So if you think about the idea that a monoculture stand of trees is going to have less diversity, let's say, for example, they're all the same species, which would really be the case, but just imagine less diversity here. And a polyculture would have more caterpillar diversity, for example. Well, when we think about caterpillar species diversity, we can also think about the diversity in their traits and their functional roles and in their overwintering life histories. So, for instance, you might have groups that have varying spaces where they overwinter. And so when we introduce a disturbance, which really that's what leaf management is, it could affect one group more strongly. But if you have a mixture of different caterpillar species, some are going to be resilient to that disturbance. And so this is the idea of biological insurance is that maybe by having a diversity of life history traits, we can mitigate some of the effects of our leaf management. So what this would look like graphically is that the difference between removing and retaining leaves in a monoculture is greater than the difference between removing and retaining leaves in a polyculture. So to test this, I used the biodiversity tree experiment at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is a large-scale tree biodiversity manipulation project where they planted trees in stands of either polycultures or monocultures. And each one of these yellow dots is where I placed one of my leaf management leaf manipulation blocks. So what I would do is, let's say we have, well, first let me talk about some of the tree species that I used here. So the plots were along the outer, or the leaf manipulation blocks were along the outer rows of these tree diversity plots, and surrounding the tree makeup of them was sweet gum, tulip poplar, sycamore trees, rhoda oaks, and northern red oaks, right? So a monoculture plot would be the entire leaf manipulation block would be all of one of those species, whereas polyculture would have a mixture of those species, of those 5 species. And then within there, I place this leaf manipulation block. So I would have a removal treatment, a pile treatment, a retain treatment, and a shred treatment. So I'd go out in the fall and we'd remove the leaves in these 2 meter square by 2 meters, 2 meter by 2 meter areas. And then I would weigh the leaves and divide them by 4. And 1/4 would get shredded, 2/4 would get added together, and then 1/4 would go back. And so in effect, you get a removal plot, a retaining plot, a shredded plot, and then a plot where the leaves have been doubled or piled. I also place temperature probes in each of the plots that are measuring the soil temperature every 15 minutes. And then in the spring, between March and July, I place emergence traps with the same 10-day egg collection period cycle as the Ferlauto design. So let's look at the results first to introducing these alternative leaf management practices. So to look at Lepidoptera first, if you retain leaves instead of removing leaves, you increase Lepidoptera emergence by 53%. And if you pile leaves instead of removing them, you increase Lepidoptera emergence by 90%. I didn't find any difference between shredding leaves and removing leaves, or piling leaves and retaining leaves. And in terms of spider emergence, if you retain the leaves instead of removing the leaves, you double the number of spiders emerging, and you get 69% increase if you pile leaves. Here I didn't find any difference, right, and again, the shredding treatment is the same as the remove treatment, pile is the same as retain. Here I didn't find any difference in parasitoid wasps. I didn't find any difference for beetles or for flies. So we're seeing, again, declines in spiders, declines in moths and butterflies. We're finding that shredding for insects is really no better than removal. But moving leaves to another location, that would be doubling it, moving it, is potentially okay. I want to show you the temperature data here. So this is the average daily temperature between March and October. This is the temperature if you remove leaves. This is the temperature if you shred leaves. This is the temperature if you retain leaves. And this is the temperature if you pile leaves. So you can just see it's very visibly apparent that there's greater temperature variation in plots where you remove and shred compared to plots where you retain and pile your leaves. So we're seeing that leaf litter does act as a buffer of soil temperatures. And just to show you some specific numbers here, if you retain leaves instead of removing leaves, you reduce your temperature variation by about 50%. And remember, temperature variation is potentially bad for those creatures that are trying to survive. Now let's move on to tree diversity. Now here there's a lot of information, so instead of showing you all the different graphs, what I've done is I've broken it down into this table here. And so when this paper is published, you can see all the information for yourself, but I'm just going to go through it real quick. So if we imagine street trees, a lot of areas in suburbia, we tend to plant monocultures. And if instead of planting monocultures, we plant polycultures, we plant a mixture of street trees, with trees in our backyards, for example, we see that we're going to decrease soil temperature variation, which, although it's a decrease, remember that's good for our overwintering insects. We're going to increase soil moisture. We're going to increase the diversity of our parasitoid wasp community, those natural enemies. I didn't find any differences for the other orders. In terms of soil processes, I didn't find any difference for the decomposition of recalcitrant material, that rubus but I did see a decrease in the decomposition rate of the late pile So in terms of mitigation, and remember mitigation is when having a diverse canopy is going to make the differences between removing leaves and retaining leaves smaller. You can see a mixed bag here. So we're seeing for microclimate regulation that, and for some soil processes, that yes, actually mitigation does reduce the impacts of removing leaves, but for other groups like the arthropod communities, I'm really not seeing signs of that. And I'm going to talk more about this first one here, this mitigation of soil temperature variation increases. So when you think about a diverse forest, think about different trees all kind of being matched together instead of the same tree, right? And that could lead to differences in how they pack their leaves in the canopy, or how their understory branches are interacting. And that could potentially be acting just like the leaves do as a temperature buffer. And so if you remember, the difference between a sign of mitigation would be where the difference between removing and retaining is smaller in the polyculture than the monoculture, and we did see some evidence for that. So here you're seeing that if you remove your leaves instead of retaining your leaves, you increase soil temperature variation by 123% in the monocultures, but in the polycultures you only increase it by 83%. So that's one example of this mitigation effect in action. So, in conclusion, we found that removing leaves reduces the abundance and diversity of arthropods. And some groups, especially Lepidoptera and spiders, are more affected than others. We see reduced soil temperature buffering. And we, in terms of soil carbon, we see legacy effects of reduced soil carbon and decomposition. And when thinking about mitigating, we see that shredding is just as harmful as removal for arthropods, but piling could be an effective alternative if you must move your leaves. And that planting a diverse canopy does mitigate some things like increased temperature variation. It also mitigates moisture, but not arthropodic, at least in this case. Now, before I finish up, I want to talk about one more thing that I found surprising. So if you remember from that first chapter, I talked about how I was replicating this design in high and low maintenance areas because we manage our yards differently throughout. Now I want to show you that now. So this is the site where we have high maintenance, and you can see that there's greater Lepidoptera emergence where you retain your leaves versus where you remove your leaves. And same thing for this low maintenance area here. But the high maintenance areas have 113% more emerging Lepidoptera overall. And this was surprising to me. This was kind of counterintuitive. And it was not only for the abundance emergence, but also for species richness. So the purple color is areas where you retain leaves, and the orange colors are areas where you remove leaves, but the shape shows which management treatment is it, or which maintenance treatment is it. So the circles are under high maintenance intensity areas, and the triangles are low maintenance intensity areas. And you can see that the high maintenance intensity areas have greater species richness. So yeah, so why could this be happening? Why is there more emergence in higher maintenance areas than low maintenance areas? Well, if we look at the context in which the leaf manipulation was done, you can see that over here, if we're introducing leaves to an area that was previously a leaf desert, there wasn't any leaves around, we're introducing a resource that could potentially be attracting species to that area. So these emergence traps, if you remember, they went on in the spring. So there was time for Lepidoptera and other species, and this pattern continues for other species. Though I just showed it for Lepidoptera, other species are more prevalent in these contained areas as well. We placed the emergence trap in the spring, they've had time to make these decisions of where they want to go. So you can imagine that yes, we have some groups like leaf miners, which are in the leaves, they're falling, where that leaf falls, they're probably overwintering. But there are other groups that are making decisions, other groups that are making decisions. So if we look at what these yard spaces might be, I want to reiterate that these are all organic yards, right? These are not high maintenance yards, and potentially if your high maintenance area involves pesticides, you're not going to have more incidents. But we're seeing that there's more light availability, there's more turf grass resources for insects that feed on turf grass, there's more ornamental plantings, right? And so this is actually habitat. This is habitat value if you retain your leaves. And if you do retain your leaves, I found there's an 84% increase in moths in these high maintenance areas, right? So you don't have to do all or nothing, right? It's not, you're either retaining your leaves or you're removing your leaves. you can keep them in some spaces. We've seen that piling is a good alternative, and we're seeing that even in those high maintenance areas, in those front yards, if you leave a section of leaves, you can do a lot to increase at least your bulk rates. So overall, this dissertation shows that there are negative impacts to leaf removal. We're seeing impacts on our arthropod communities. We're seeing less abundance, especially in particular groups like spiders and parasitoid wasps. We're seeing shifts in the composition of communities. We're seeing that soil decomposition is slowing. We're seeing legacy effects over many years that persist even after the disturbance has ceased. And we're seeing a loss of the ability of the soil to buffer soil temperature changes. So with that, I want to say thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the Burkhardt Lab for being so helpful with this process. I could never have done this alone. All of the technicians that helped sort insects, collect the insects. There's a huge amount of work that went into this. I especially want to thank Kristen, who helped me design and build these emergence traps. And I just want to give a shout out to Maggie here, who has drawn these beautiful drawings by hand. So really wonderful drawings there. And I want to thank you to my committee for help and support. And with that, I will take any questions.
So thanks, Max. So at this time, anybody who has questions from the public and would like to ask Max about his research, you're welcome to do so. Amy is on the questions online. Awesome. For committee members, if you would mind holding the questions for now, you're going to have plenty of time to ask after that. So, do you have questions? Does it matter how deep the pile will be? Like, is there a point where you've got some stacked up the bits at the bottom on the leaf?
I definitely think so. So I only looked at a doubling of the leaf litter, so it's not really this huge massive pile. It's more this idea of a soft landing. But yeah, the cues that the insects need in the winter to know that it's time to emerge could get disrupted. The thicker the leaves, and also you could have too much moisture and could lead to rot and things like that.
When you were working with the homeowners after seeing this and all of this, did you see any changes in their management practices?
I did, but I didn't follow up with every single one. A lot of them were very supportive of the idea in general, but yeah, because of your neighbors and everything, you have to maintain your lawn in a certain way. And so I think having the excuse of a yard sign that said, "Oh, this is for a study," was helpful for some of them.
Really into this, so I think a lot of people are willing to put their leaves in their backyard, certainly I'm, in that camp. It gets harder to do that in the front yard. I mean, in part because leaves will blow around. Maybe the leaves that you left in your front yard are down your neighbor's yard, maybe anything like that. Just wondering whether you have thought about it or have seen it in particularly effective ways, given the impacts that you see, the positive impacts of having leaves in maybe those more managed spaces, of getting, what are some options that you can suggest for having more leaves in the front yard?
I would say, first of all, a yard sign is great. If you can tell people what you're doing so they don't just think you're being lazy. And they have a lot of beautiful yard signs. In fact, one of them was from the Xerces Society. So that's something you can do. You can create like a garden edging kind of, which will kind of create a barrier so it looks like it's done on purpose, but it'll also kind of contain your leaves so they don't blow into your neighbor's yard. Those are two things I can think of.
Very quick research. I was wondering, so the first study, when you retain leaves, you saw an increase in Coleoptera, but in the last study, that was in the third chapter, you didn't see it. So do you have any hypothesis on why that is?
Sure. So So CERC is in a more rural area, first of all, and it's a forest. And these are suburban yards, so we're getting different types of communities. One hypothesis I found, and if you look, you can actually see that there are, although I don't believe it's statistically significant, there are greater beetle numbers in areas without any leaves and bare ground. And I'm thinking that possibly one of the reasons for that is that in these forests you have more different types of species, and some of them may prefer that habitat. I know in my my full-time job, tiger beetles love this bare open hunting surface, and actually one of the issues that we have is there's not enough space of that. And so we do prescribed burns and we clear away leaf litter to encourage tiger beetle habitat. I didn't look at the species composition of the beetles themselves, but I would imagine that that kind of plays a role.
Yeah, so we have a few questions here that came in via the chat. But we'll go ahead, we have somebody with a raised hand here, and that's Don Weber. So Don, if you wanna unmute yourself, feel free to just shout it out here to the room.
Thanks. Yeah, great job. Can you hear me?
Oh, no, sorry, Don, we can't hear you. All right, we're gonna move on to the other question now. So Ian wants to know, why do you think shredding leaves has the measured effect?
So shredding leaves could be just destroying the insects. So to shred them, we put them through a yard waste mulcher. A lot of other people use a lawnmower, but I think chopping up the individuals is one possibility. But also we saw that the leaf litter is a lot less effective. Even if you preserve it, if it's shredded, it's a lot less effective as buffering soil temperature. So those are two reasons that I could think shredding would be just as harmful.
Can I try one more time?
Questions? Well, let's go ahead and try Don one more time here.
Okay, does it work?
Oh, hold on.
Max.
I'm now thinking what could be the issue.
So
We just could just not have the audio up, Don. Give me a second. Hey Don, you wanna try that one more time?
Okay, yeah, great. Can you hear me now?
No, sorry. Stop. Doesn't look like it's gonna happen. You can put your question in the chat though. I'll do my best to make it make sense.
So while that's happening, so you just had a question about shredding for insects. Do you want to talk a little bit about the results for decomposition?
sure, yeah. So shredding is good for decomposition. So you can imagine what decomposers are doing is they're breaking down material, allowing microbes to access the different carbon and nitrogen better. So what we found when we also looked at decomposition in the alternative leaf management study, and it was pretty interesting because the effects of shredding increased decomposition rates. And when I looked at mass loss of that recalcitrant material, the mitigation effect that I mentioned very briefly there was happening in the polycultures, where potentially those microorganisms were ready and excited once the leaves were broken down by the shredding. Whereas in the monocultures, we potentially don't have some of those microbial groups, and the shredding was not significant there.
Do we have a question? We do. So, Dawn, thanks for your patience as we figured out how to get your question to Max. Repiling shouldn't you have seen double the abundance in this treatment to say it is okay? Question mark? Also, what about bark wood chip mulches? Any thoughts?
Right, so the first question is, would we expect double? Well, not necessarily, because for two reasons. One, remember these emergence traps are going on in the springtime, so it's not just that we're taking the stuff from the control plot, putting it, or stuff from the removed plot and putting it onto the leaf pile plot. There's opportunities for other groups to find a way in, so we could expect it to be more than double in some cases. Or we could expect it to be less than double if there are below ground species, and we're obviously not moving those when we're moving the leaf. In terms of leaf mulch, I didn't look at leaf mulch, I'm sorry, it was wood mulch, wasn't it? In terms of wood mulch, I didn't look at wood mulch. Bark mulch, yeah. Generally that's like from that's purchased, right? Or are you talking about shredding the trees themselves on the property? The purposed mulch, I think, would have benefits to the soil temperature buffering. I think there are some papers that show that. I think there are also some papers that show it's beneficial for natural enemies. But again, you want to make sure that it's not so deep that you're preventing the emergence in spring or you're disrupting their fuse.
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming, and let's give Max another round.